Hi, class. Gigi Berardi here again. And I wanted to say a few things about some of the modules before jumping into energy considerations in sustainable agriculture. So what I'm going to do is share screen. And here we have our modules. Now I can see more than you can. And so don't be alarmed if your canvas doesn't look exactly like this. But you're in the middle of the entry module, which is to read the Wes Jackson book and look at segments from Food Inc. And then answer short answer essay questions that I've written, and discussion questions. And I know, and they're coming in now about what you're interested in. I'm very curious about that. And in this capstone, and then you'll see that for discussion, threaded discussions, that I try and combine the guest lectures with lecture material for you to respond about. And once you post, to also comment on at least one other student's post. So that is the entry module. The first module is a long one, and I've alerted you to this, I believe, and I am alerting you to this now because it's such an important topic on soils. And it represents a huge paradigm shift, this idea that soils are a biological organism rather than a bunch of chemicals to which you can add additional chemicals and get sustainable results, that is, over a long period of time. And so the soils narration is important from Dan and the cover crops, and as well, especially for those working in the arts and gardens, for extra credit. And then you have 3 guest lectures. 2, Jessica Guigeot and Troy Lenson, they're dairy farmers. One milks 30 ruminants and the other 700. So the scale is completely different. And but Troy Lenson's operation can be considered an integrated farm in that waste, he doesn't like that word for manure, but manure is recycled on his farm. Anyway, there's a number of things to think about as you're looking at sustainable agricultural operations and where they are on the scale spectrum, and then what they're doing to integrate all the components of their farm to have a sustainable operation. Dr. Michael Appleby, though, is going to be talking about animal welfare. So I think that's particularly relevant as we're looking at the bottom line in agriculture, and how and when and what and where do we treat animals in it. So I hope you enjoy that lecture. The reading and video responses, as you'll find for these 5 sets of reading and video responses, take the form of a quiz just because it's easier to assess that way. But you'll see for the quizzes that you watch the video and then you answer questions. So all these questions are getting at, and there's quite a few for this module, what is the nature of soils? Because if we truly understand it, it's going to affect the way in which we manage the soils in terms of soil health and soil fertility. So that's why these soil videos, pieces of the soil videos we're asking you to look at, are so important. But there is one very special article, this Reflections on the Nature of Soil and its Biomantle. And that really, in this kind of almost philosophical, in an almost philosophical sense, changed the way in which we think about soils, a paradigm shift, if you will, a complete conceptual shift in trying to understand the soil layer as the biomantle of the earth. So I hope you'll enjoy that. then you get a chance to dig into Foodwise and make some comments. Okay, excellent. All right, so that is the first module after the entry module, and that's on soils. And then we have this module on sustainable agriculture. What do we mean by it in terms of permaculture, organics, and biodynamics? And so, as I mentioned, Dan has gone through some material regarding kind of the essence of these different production systems. And I want to look at it from an energy perspective. But you'll see that you've got guest lectures, Brian Kirkfleet for permaculture, although he is a biodynamicist too, Henning Semsdorf on biodynamics, and from the Goetheanum, a triad of 3 young people who are taking the Goetheanum by storm, certainly biodynamic agriculture, which is called the land section there at the Goetheanum. And they give you their take on biodynamics. And that's from kind of Biodynamic Central, if you will. And I actually set these up for you in narrative I've written on each of these pages. All right. And then for the responses in this section, you'll see that we take them one by one: permaculture, organics, and biodynamics. And not quite as lengthy in terms of the items you'll be talking about as in soils, but close. There's a lot of material here as we try and distinguish between these 3 kinds of production systems. Okay, let's go to the PowerPoint then for this module, for module 2. I'm going over energy and agriculture. Dan's going over items related to these production systems that we consider to be quintessential sustainable agriculture. And I'm going to make a few comments about the systems also at the end. All right, energy and agriculture. So there's a lot that's used of energy in agriculture. And the greatest efficiencies are achieved, of course, when you eat. Nice. When you eat the agriculture directly. Got too many chords here. And so that will be when you eat fruit like tomatoes or herbs like basil. And although there's not many calories in those vegetable products, as opposed to using the vegetables, grains, soy, other concentrates to feed livestock and then eat the livestock, or to feed cheese, milk the cheese, process the milk into milk the animals, the dairy animals, process that milk into cheese and other dairy products. So there's efficiencies and energy lost at each step of the way. And that is why when people talk about vegan or vegetarian diets, they can talk about it in terms of being energy efficient. We're running out of fossil fuels, although we may never use the last drop of fossil fuel because it'll be so expensive. We can look at fossil fuels as non-renewable resources, not because the reservoir can't be drained almost immediately. I'm really sorry. I am not sure what's going on here in terms of the jumpiness of my equipment here. But anyway, the rate at which we can extract the resource is limited only by money and technology, but the resource is there: the coal, the tar sands, the oil. as compared to renewable energy, where the supply is virtually limitless. The sun, winds, which ultimately relates to solar energy, but anyway. But the rate at which we can extract the energy, that is, let's just say produce electricity from the original renewable resource, that varies. The sun only shines for 12 hours or 10 hours or a day. The winds are infrequent, not consistent. And so it's an interesting dichotomy or differentiation between the non-renewable resource, which is virtually limitless at any one time, limited only by technology and money available to extract it, but the reservoir is finite, and renewable energy resources, where we have to have some kind of patience to be in sync with natural cycles associated with the availability of the solar and the wind and the tidal energy, if you will. The United States produces a lot of oil, so I've got these data in here for you. You can see who are the heavy oil producers and have been for some time, but then also look at the oil consumption. Not only do we produce a fifth of the oil, but we use a fifth of the oil. And it's not necessarily the same fifth due to trade restrictions and trade agreements and trying to meet balance of payments. It's a little complicated. All right, so enter agriculture. In the United States, 400 gallons of oil equivalents are expended annually to feed each USA resident. So agricultural energy consumption can be broken down as almost a third going into inorganic fertilizer. So synthetic fertilizers, about a fifth for the operation of field equipment, and on it goes. The big energy user, now these are direct and indirect energy costs, if you will, this kind of energy accounting. But still, it gives us one would argue from an environmental perspective, a better look at what are these energy costs exactly. What is draining energy reserves, if you will, in agriculture? What part of agriculture? And it's synthetic fertilizers. Sorry. There is a regional geography to agriculture. So in Washington State, we have our apples and timber products, wood products, and fruits and vegetables in California. And in the Midwest, we have livestock and we have grains. Here's corn, here's wheat, the wheat belt, which experiences less than 20 inches of precipitation a year, so it needs less moisture than corn does over here. More hogs and livestock, poultry in the Southeast, and dairy, the Great Lakes area, and also in New York State. And the reason there's complicated reasons as to why we find these particular products in these particular areas, but one of them does have to do with the regional geography being particularly well suited for the production of these. But there's more. Cheap labor force, a docile labor force, subsidized irrigation. Vegetables and fruits don't grow by themselves in California. They grow with a lot of subsidized water. The same is true also in Oregon and Washington State too, and other Western states. So we have to look at the policy structures also behind the growing of these products. Okay, everybody. Just going to soldier on. I'll just go here. So what happened, I'd like you to look at these graphs in terms of when there was a huge increase. And you can see that it happened around World War II. Look at fertilizers here. And nitrogen fertilizer in particular became very popular, available, economically affordable around World War II. And the story goes is that ammonium nitrate was one of those fertilizers, had been used for explosives and was used as a substrate for the production of nitrogen fertilizer after the war. And if you look at corn production, that is yields as measured by bushels per acre, you can see that there was a huge increase again around World War II, when fertilizers were going to be were first used, synthetic fertilizers in bulk. They were around since the 19th century for sure, in one form or another, but being mass produced towards the end of World War II really was a decisive factor in terms of popularizing the use of the fertilizer and increasing yields. And as you might be able to infer, nitrogen is the limiting factor. Isn't so much phosphorus, but nitrogen is a limiting factor for plant growth, for which if you add nitrogen fertilizer, you get a huge yield response. And that makes sense. Us humans need protein too. That's our nitrogen, that is our nitrogen source. Okay. So if we look at corn production, only 10% of the energy for corn production comes from fossil fuel. Really, most of the energy that is needed to produce a kernel of corn comes from the sun through photosynthesis. But it does get a boost with oil and petroleum products. And so that 10% is only 10%, a tenth of the total, but it still represents a huge amount when you figure out how much corn is being produced in the United States. Okay, I actually am going to go here. See if it's less jumping. I know it's not as nice. Okay, so there's many inputs needed for corn production, and you can see them here, all of which in turn require energy. The energy required to produce machinery, to operate the machinery, I don't know, to feed the workers who are in the steel manufacturing factories, miners of coal. There's standards for how far back you go in determining how much energy is used in agriculture. Production of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and certainly the amount of energy that's used in the production of chemicals. Chemical fertilizers is nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, but also in biocides of different types. Then there's energy used in drying products and in storage and transport, in producing seed. There's energy lost in transport and in distribution. And then to this, we could add waste, the 1/3 of the food that's wasted in the United States, if you're looking at the entire food system, from the point of production to the point of consumption and beyond. How much food is discarded in the home, in the cafeteria, in the school. Okay, and when I was talking about feeding the miners and daycare for the steel mill workers, that's what's referred to as embodied energy. So it's not the actual barrels of petroleum or pounds of coal that are being used, but it's the energy used for their production. We call that the embodied energy. We've talked about that 10%, 90% in the corn plant and what that distribution is, solar versus external inputs, if you will, external manufactured inputs from the fossil fuel. But processing the corn requires even more energy. And if you look here, this is the amount of energy in calories, 3,260, to produce 375 calories of canned corn. Look at the distribution here. So a lot for packaging, not as much for production compared to beef, where if you want to produce 375 calories of beef, you're going to need almost 10 times the amount of calories, because look at the production. Just the production is so expensive in terms of one step back in actually growing the corn, growing the soy, the processing of that. It's used to feed the animals, the amount of water that's needed, the amount of energy that's required to manage waste adds up. And we could say that corn-fed animals versus consuming corn directly uses approximately 10 times the amount of energy. You see here about 30,000 calories or kilocalories and about 3,000 here for the canned corn. So eat canned corn or eat grass-fed beef that are not fed corn, and don't eat very much of it. So it kind of brings up the question of, meat, no meat. It could be it's not so much meat, no meat. It's like a little bit of meat versus a lot of meat. And saving your pennies so you can afford grass-fed beef if you're not raising your animals yourself, and eating less of it. But anyway, you can see the inefficiencies here. It's true for other animals also, in a way, but in terms of an industrial agriculture's perspective, once you put a lot of animals in a confined area and they don't move, they're not going to actually waste very much energy. I don't find this a humane and from that standpoint acceptable way to raise animals, but it's true. And fowl in particular, turkeys and chickens, pigeons, are particularly efficient in the way in which they metabolize nutrients and produce muscle mass, for looking at broilers. But this is exactly the kind of thing, and here we are in the capstone class, where we go, okay, yeah, but these animals have more disease. They can, so additives have to be added, prophylactics to their feed. Yeah, but they may need to be administered antibiotics. Yeah, but the animal behavior, as Michael Appleby talks about, is not natural. And that not natural may have a cost in terms of chemicals, as I just alluded to, that have to be added to their diet. Yeah, but in Denmark, with the swine production, the amount of pollution and degradation there due to accidental contamination, it may not be worth the cost. Right? So we look at all these externalities that I'm sure you're familiar with from other classes, and looking at other systems. So this is why we kind of look at perennial agriculture as a, for example, tree fruits, which require less inputs, and we still get a reasonable amount of calories. This is, of course, the basis of a foundational piece to permaculture. with his focus on perennials. So Wes Jackson talked about this in the entry module. And now in this module, we spend some time looking at permaculture and the benefits of permaculture for sure. And well, what are they? Okay, see Dan's excellent PowerPoint presentation. I've listened to it, and I'm just going to add a few notes here. So really think about, reflect on permaculture principles and maxims and guidelines. It's really all about careful land management, about being patient, about observing the kinds of things that Wes Jackson talked about. Earthworks such as swale building for water conservation. An Inspiration Farm is such a good example of this. And you've got the guest lecture from Brian Kirkfleet, yes. It's not as good as being at the farm, I know, but he actually invites students to come visit, if not intern. And he also has something called CIA, Citizen Involved Agriculture, not a CSA so much. That depends. He goes back and forth on this, where people can come and actually be involved in some of the work on the farm and walk away with boxes of produce. And so anyway, so Dan talks about this at greater length in his presentation. It has taken Brian Kirkfleet years to build up these dozens of swales, his berms, the half dozen or so ponds that he has, spawns, he calls some of them swales plus ponds, a long time. And he's had a chance to observe what are the optimal conditions for growth, for communities of plants to grow and thrive. And yeah, he produces pine nuts and citrus and hundreds and hundreds of different fruits and vegetables. So that also is a characteristic of permaculturalists too. You'll see it too if you ever get a chance to visit or take a course with the Bullock brothers on Orcas Island. We used to take field trips there. A little bit energy intensive, and then we have not really a second best, a first best, right, in Whatcom County. But you should visit the website, and they do take visitors. Organic. Oh, let me just get rid of that. Anyway, huge controversy regarding what to include and restrict in the USDA National Organic Standards Act in 1990. And you'll see it took 5 years to actually come up with the organic rule, what's called the organic rule. The USDA claims that they've had more letters, more correspondence about what should and shouldn't be in the organic rule than any other policy instrument. Who's going to win here? The sun. I'm almost done. To the point where you're not going to be able to see me at all, or me. Anyway, and yeah, so there was a lot of controversy about what should be included, what shouldn't, and it came down to 3 things, although there's exceptions. No GMOs, no GMO seed, no GMO animals, no industrial sewage sludge, and that was a big blow for mega organic soil fertility operations. This is great. I just changed this since I'm here. No irradiation. Spices, for example, are typically irradiated. Yeah, the spices that you buy in the supermarket. So restrictions on production and processing. And do you understand about the mega organic? One of the things that would make mega organic operations possible, don't worry, there's plenty of them, is access to sewage sludge, because that's a readily available source of fertility. So they had some setbacks there by restrictions being put on using human waste, even though it had been treated. Many organic farmers feel that these restrictions do not go far enough, so they call themselves Beyond Organic. So, Brian Kirkfleet calls himself Beyond Organic, but also Larry Stapp of Twin Brooks Creamery. You may have consumed their chocolate milk. And his dairy cows are on pasture for longer than what is mandated by the organic rule. And so he calls himself Beyond Organic, and he has no organic certification. They don't use GMOs in their feed. It just doesn't fill out the paperwork to become certified organic. He figures the glass is enough. And the non-homogenized, it's about as close as you can get to raw milk as is possible, because it's a low vat, because it's a slow, low temperature vat pasteurization. They use Jersey, very high cream, high fat milk. The animals are pastured, it's glass bottles. Okay, so lots of questions there about organic and whether organic has been co-opted, and Dan addresses this in his presentation. I will say, I don't think he mentions this, that Growing Washington is a consortium now of farms, basically, and it surrendered its organic certification. It's a little bit difficult to understand, but they used manure from local dairies in Whatcom County, and the farmers had used aminopyralids to control thistle, and there were still traces of it in the manure. When it was used, even though it was slightly composted on these vast acres, okay, like 68, I shouldn't say. This was early on in Growing Washington's life, but on a serious amount of acreage for Growing Washington, they had a broadleaf kill, up to 60% broadleaf kill, and other organic farms in the area started using, because you can use animal manure from conventional dairies in the organic rule. You can do that. And they did. And 60% on an average of the broadleaf plants were killed. That's vegetables as we know it, in Whatcom County. This was referred to as the aminopyralid disaster, and Growing Washington went on record as surrendering its organic certification, saying it meant nothing if the rules allow you to, for example, use manure from conventional dairies, and they can have pesticides in the manure active from the animals grazing pastures where those chemicals were first applied. And they were making a statement on how meaningless the organic rule is. Okay, and this is our last few slides. Yeah, biodynamic, the Gertianum in Switzerland. And Dan has a few slides on this, and he talks about where I had my sabbatical. I've had a long time interest in biodynamics, but as much the philosophy behind it as the practice. And so this is where I was in Switzerland. This is where I take my classes, the Global Learning Program, for a week now in the summer, but it's where I was for half a year. And my office was in this glass house. And right over here. I was the first scholar in 100 years since its inception. It's a very closed organization. It's hard to get in. And I learned a teeny bit because I was so busy working on my book Food Wise, but definitely want to go back. And I do each year, where I take my students and we study biodynamic beekeeping with Johannes Wirtz. And we have lectures, interact with those three spokespeople for biodynamics. The land section, you have the guest lecture. from them on biodynamic farming. The best example locally is S&S Homestead on Lopez Island in Washington State. And it's where we're going this spring. But you can contact Henning Semsdorf. We have a guest lecture from him, and see if he would accept visitors or interns. People intern there too, and these are my students working in the fields. All right, last slide. Mont Blanc in the background, and Dornac is where we go in the global learning program. And it's right at the corner of France, Germany, and Switzerland. But let me say, you don't have to go to Dornac to study biodynamic farming, because biodynamic farming is really a journey not only in observing the development of the farm organism, but also the farmer herself. It's about the development of the farmer herself and himself too. And so we've given you some materials to see and reflect upon biodynamics, what that means to you, and get your opinion. Because if it works, it's the best renewable resource. Because it's not about substance, it's about essence. It's a kind of homeopathic farming where you don't need much substance. Not a whole lot of fertilizers, no chemicals. The inputs are of a completely different nature. And so Henning Semsdorf actually is Washington State University demonstration site, and Washington State University is studying the efficiency of his production and with so little inputs. And in particular, looking at how pH can be adjusted, not necessarily with inputs of lime, which is a huge amount of material, but with biodynamic preparations, which are very, very, very small doses, basically, of fermented herbs prepared a certain way. And they have been able to see similar results, whether you're using a lot of substance, like the lime, or a little bit of the essence, at least at S&S Homestead. And Washington State is published on this. So, but we'll see. It's an open question. Just trying to figure out what's the best way to produce food and on what scale, and what are the resources that are needed, and can they be made, and are they readily available? All right, so those are my few comments, and I'm going to stop share. Yep. And look forward to seeing your responses in discussions.